Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to SDF's third webinar on aspects of the COVID-19 response. I'm Dave Little from the Scottish Drugs Forum, and this webinar will focus on benzodiazepine use and prescribing during the pandemic. High rates of street benzodiazepines has been a feature of problem drug use in Scotland for decades as part of a polydrug using culture. The issue of whether and how to prescribe benzodiazepines has long been discussed, but the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown these issues into stark relief. In this webinar, we seek to explore these issues in detail. I should add that guidance on benzodiazepines prescribing is planned as part of the medication-assisted treatment work being undertaken under the Drug Desk Task Force. And as part of that work, it will be important to take account of practice changes during the pandemic in relation to benzodiazepine prescribing. SDF's COVID-19 guidance version 2 will also highlight these issues. We've got 3 speakers today, and we're very grateful for their time to come and speak to us. The first is Digby Thomas from Midlothian Substance Misuse Service and Edinburgh Access Practice. Prun Bijral from Change Grow Live, and Garrett McGovern from Priority Medical Clinic Ireland. I will ask each of them to speak for a maximum of 10 minutes, which will allow 30 minutes for questions. If you look on the sidebar on the right-hand side of your computer, you will see a questions tab. So please ask any questions as we go along. Austin Smith, SDF's policy officer, will endeavour to summarise key issues being raised, and we'll put these to the panel after they've all spoken. So if I could ask our first speaker, Digby Thomas. Thanks, Digby.
Thanks very much, Dave, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. The good news is you're spared my good looks because of NHS blocking on some of the IT, but I'm happy to be here. I hope everyone's washed their hands, and try not to get too much of your lunch stuck in your keyboard, please. As the slide shows, I've done a few interesting GP-orientated things in my career, and lately the 3 roles spilling out from my portfolio are 3.5 days a week as a GP for homeless people in Edinburgh, at the Edinburgh Access Practice, 1.5 days a week as a GPSI in substance misuse for Midlothian, a county just south of Edinburgh, about 80,000 population. And since the late 80s, I've been in old school, and now with the 2004 contract, a new school out of hours GP, which still gets me into, for instance, care homes, gowned and gloved and laying hands on COVID positive people. So still living the high life. I guess each of us could take some learning outcomes away from this webinar, but if I had a starter for 10, it would be keep calm and carry on with our usual high quality practice. I think probably what we're all experiencing is that whilst the customary rules have been suspended and it feels like everybody's on holiday rules, and anything goes. In fact, if we can just hold on and anchor ourselves to our usual standards of practice, then we're far less likely to come a bit unstuck. Benzo use and prescribing during the pandemic. In my line of work as a GP for homeless folk and substance misuse patients, that might be a bit of an outlier. It tends to be that there are only a few folk who are only on a benzodiazepine prescription for dependence, and probably those patients are being looked after by their GPs in primary care rather than any kind of specialist service. So in practical terms, the pandemic often the housekeeping arrangements and the pragmatism we're having to look at has got as much to do, if not more to do, with their coincidental opiate substitute therapy as anything particular to their benzo use, but we can maybe talk about withdrawals later on. And the context that struck me when I was thinking about speaking today was how much in Scotland the old east-west split, the customary parsimony you might find in Edinburgh and the East Coast. I've been a partner in GP practices in Edinburgh and in Aberdeen inner city practices, And in the old days, for love nor money, I'm talking maybe 30 years ago, you couldn't get somebody to start, a GP to start prescribing, let alone a pharmacy to be dispensing. Whereas nowadays, Edinburgh, far from come in, you'll have had your tea. I think we're probably a lot looser in our prescribing and dispensing practices at the best of times, and it's our colleagues through in Glasgow who have managed to reduce the amount of diversion and leakage into the local communities by being tighter on their routine prescribing and dispensing of things like methadone and diazepam. I wanted to maybe illustrate some of the points I would want to make with looking at three clinical scenarios. And the first and most common one that's been happening since the COVID measures and lockdown has been our patients asking for relaxation in the normal dispensing arrangements. Somebody who's maybe been on a daily pickup for their benzo alongside daily supervision of their opiate replacement, opiate substitute therapy. Since most of the pharmacies, even when we ask them to continue supervising, most of the pharmacies, to keep their heads above water, are not supervising many folk, unless you speak to them very nicely on an individual case-by-case basis. A lot of the time we're then relaxing to maybe 3 or even twice a week pickups for that, and the patients are often looking for something along, and often we're giving them along the same lines for their benzos. But my most frequent request along those lines is usually met by a quick cursory look at the notes, and I'll say, but the trouble is, Fred, you're 26 and you haven't asked for your inhalers about your asthma for 2 years, and it would look a little bit easier if your last toxicology result hadn't lit up like a Christmas tree. And so a lot of the commonest requests for the current scenario are along those lines, and it's not too hard on clinical grounds to be able to state that wouldn't be appropriate. Within myself, I'm also thinking that completely devalues the kind of arrangements we're having to make for folk who genuinely do have to self-isolate, or are shielding, or are vulnerable, or are disabled and living at home. And so I tend to not to be relaxing those kinds of requests. I expect we're all getting similar requests, though. My second scenario is when we're getting requests for detoxes off benzos sometimes, and in fact, just before phoning in here, I had a consultation at the practice. Somebody, our in-house pharmacist, was saying, a patient was saying they were going to withdrawals, and what could we do about that? Again, my normal response would be acute withdrawal from most stuff might not be appropriate to be looked after in the community anyway, as opposed to accident and emergency. And of course, they're all sitting in A&E twiddling their thumbs these days, so they've got nothing better to do. I don't present it that way, of course. I usually present the clinical reasons why, particularly on a Friday afternoon, it's not going to be appropriate for us to help out with the detox too much. Interestingly, of course, we'll come across folk who are looking for a diazepam detox, but their toxicology is suggesting they're not actually taking any diazepam or other benzo. The benzo test is coming up negative. And I think as recently as maybe a year ago, half the folk who were coming up positive for atizolam in their toxicology didn't know what it was, but they're now realizing pretty quickly that the street valleys that they think they're buying doesn't have any valley in them whatsoever, which then presents us with an interesting ethical scenario. Is that what are the ethics of starting someone on a diazepam benzo detox when they actually don't have a diazepam conventional benzo dependence, particularly with the tendency nowadays to get folk to sign up to diazepam agreements where they realize they're being prescribed something which will cognitively impair them in the short run, and in the long run may affect their chances of developing dementing diseases in the future. My own personal feeling is that since the vast majority of any kind of benzo detoxes usually fall off about halfway down before they open up, where they get down to maybe 10 or 15 milligrams of diazepam before being open about being open about topping up on their prescription, and then it becomes apparent, if it wasn't from the start, that a detox prescription isn't what they're looking for at all, and what they really want is maintenance and not have to spend so much of their money on poor quality illicit benzos off the streets. The third scenario I wanted to bring up was the genuine, when I say genuine, that's not to say that the two previous scenarios don't have an air of genuineness about them. The patients are feeling the pain that they're feeling, and they're looking for help with that. And I'm happy to accept that they're making an appropriate health-seeking behaviour in approaching us and being open about their issues. And I usually accept that, and indeed can compliment them on seeking that kind of help, even if the help that I'm able to offer might be not what they're after. But the third scenario is where you have someone who's genuinely having to self-isolate because they're COVID positive, or they are in the shielding group and they're best not getting out of the house and exposing themselves to the virus, potential of the virus, or they're already vulnerable or shielding. And we're having to arrange deliveries in that kind of situation. A sideline to this scenario is one that, alongside the relaxed dispensing, where we fairly quickly have found some of our patients presenting having been assaulted, to have their medication taken off them when they are coming out the pharmacy, or indeed being slightly more cuckooed at home and having it taken off them there. One of our practice colleagues noticed a long queue out of from the door from one of our local pharmacies, and one or two local suspects, kind of like vultures, pursuing or surveying the scene and deciding which victim they might pick off on their way the way out of the pharmacy. So we need to be aware of that when we're relaxing our dispensing arrangements. And like many of you, I expect you've got systems in place to start delivering prescriptions to pharmacies, because we're trying to reduce the footfall in our services, both at my practice, for instance, and in my substance misuse outpatient service. So much more done, nearly everything being done over the phone, and making arrangements to try and minimise folk having to come to us. If we can deliver their prescriptions to the pharmacy, then that helps. And we have staff colleagues doing that on their way home or nipping out at lunchtime. Third sector colleagues from locally, for instance, CGL, will do that in parts of town where they have the contract. Localities of Edinburgh, they have 3 of the contracts out of 4. Turning Point, Maintain, North East and Leith. And volunteers, we have med students at the practice who will come round most days and do a bike run. One's got a car, I think, and will deliver to pharmacies. The delivery of controlled drugs from the pharmacies to our patients who are self-isolating can be a little more problematic. Has to be done by experienced people in twos, whether those are local authority colleagues or clinical colleagues from the practice and from the service. You can't leave it if they're not in. You can't give it to somebody else if that other person answers the door. And often as not, I have to say, even for these relatively closeted scenarios you might imagine, so often the patient actually isn't in. And for my kind of patient, they might be out begging at their usual pitch outside the supermarket, sometimes rather ironically outside the supermarket within which is the pharmacy they would normally be getting their prescription. Which lends another ethical layer to how far we go to help our patients out. And so these are the practical scenarios that we're dealing with probably most commonly since the COVID lockdown. I think my outgoing message for my slot here is that the nice thing about being a GP is that we can do anything. All doctors are used to, all of us are used to managing risk, but GPs are the best gamblers of all. I say that to the odd patient now and again. We're gambling with your health. Once I've got their attention, I'll point out what I'm meaning is I'm playing the probabilities. What's the probability that this patient's headache sitting in front of me now is their brain tumour or not? And so similar kind of judgments being made. Is this really a person who we need to make special arrangements to make sure they're able to safely get and take and concord with their benzodiazepine prescription? So here endeth my lesson. I'm ready to be muted.
Great, thanks, Digby. It's the first time I've heard GPs described as the biggest gamblers, but I'll hang on to that phrase certainly. If I can move now to our second speaker, and we're very pleased to have Garrett join us from Ireland, who's going to be speaking next. Over to you, Garrett. Thanks.
Yeah, so many thanks, Dave, and many thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk. This is a really interesting topic. Well, I suppose it's two interesting topics, really. It's COVID-19, and it's also about benzos. Although I think when we talked the other day, I made the point that probably my talk may well be the COVID-19 part of my talk may not be that important, because I think a lot of what I do hasn't really changed very much in terms of benzos, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Just a little bit about my own background. I went to medical school in Dublin, Trinity College Dublin, qualified in 1995. Did a few house jobs in hospitals, worked in the emergency department, didn't do conventional GP training, although I worked as a GP. I really went straight into the addiction services. In the late 90s, they were recruiting doctors to deal with this sort of heroin problem, which quite honestly had been around at least 10 years, probably longer. And this was in 1998. So a lot of us came into this. There was absolutely no training. There was no guidance. I often say to people, I don't know how we didn't kill more people in those early days, because the stuff we were doing was just nuts, really. I think I must have been about 8 months in before I even knew what opiate tolerance was. It was that bad, I have to say, the training. So we all just found our feet, and we got into it. And we have a long history in Ireland of and I don't know if this is any different in Scotland, of sort of polarization of views about what best practice, what constitutes best practice. And in those days when I came in, low doses were kind of the norm. Everything was no benzos, no takeaways, and actually we were big into, and kind of still are, into urine testing. So testing twice a week, testing at least once a week, and giving people chances. And if they didn't sort of give opiate-free tests, or even cocaine, believe it or not, free, they would be punished, and they would be put off the program under the guise of that they would overdose if we kept them on maintenance, which now we know is absurd. That overdose risk goes through the roof when you exclude people from treatment. But that's the way we did it in those days. But we a few of us sort of pulled together. We got kind of more aligned to international thinking. I went to London, I did a master's. I went on, got some further postgraduate qualifications. I pretty regular attender of conferences, and I realized, me and a few colleagues, that really we're doing it all wrong in Ireland. So we need to kind of move with the times. Moving on to this issue of benzos, and we have made a lot of strides. We've had a good few reviews. Michael Farrell came over and did a review. One of your own guys, great guy, Sackett Priyadarshi, came over and did a review a number of years ago. And, it's a story in itself, and Sackett can tell the story. But, he did find some problems with the way in which we were practicing in terms of guidelines. In terms of benzos, this is a very, very polarizing problem. There's no getting away from it. And there's very, very little in the way of agreement about what's best practice, because most of the guidelines in relation to benzo prescribing are really not for benzo dependence. They're for generalized anxiety disorder. So, as GPs working in this area, and I work in specialist services as well as general practice, we're all agreed that treating generalized anxiety disorder as a first line with benzos probably is not the best thing to do. It's probably best to do other non-pharmacological interventions like CBT and yoga and relaxation and exercise and all that sort of stuff, and deal with people who are suffering from anxiety and panic attacks. Occasionally, PRN diazepam is not bad for people, or when I talk, when I'm talking to generalized anxiety disorder patients, we sometimes do this thing where they have a 5 milligram tablet in their wallet or their purse, so that they as part of that CBT, to prevent them from feeling extra panicky that's there if they need to take it. The risks of dependence in those circumstances is really minimal. But a lot of the people I treat are benzodiazepine dependent, and really the importance of assessing benzodiazepine important is, do they meet the criteria for dependence? Now, I am aware that not everything you hear from patients is exactly the truth, and I accept that. But you've got to, one of the things I always say to people, it's not whether you prescribe benzos for someone who's benzodiazepine dependent or could possibly be, or you don't prescribe, it's do you think about it? And I do have colleagues in Ireland who decide that they have a blanket prejudice to benzos. So, and these are people now working in opiate substitution treatment services who would be treating people on methadone treatment with all the problems that come with that, all the hepatitis C and HIV and all that, but they just have a view that benzos are bad and that they shouldn't prescribe them. So they decide to ignore it. To a certain extent they do, except some of these patients are coming in quite seriously dependent and they're quite intoxicated sometimes. And that, usually what happens is their dose is reduced of opiate substitution treatment. Understandably, if somebody's coming in intoxicated like that would be understandable. But it's not really dealing with the problem. So we've got to try and deal with the problem. And yeah, we do have to deal with the underlying problem in relation to benzos. So I have a view basically that you need to assess the problem. Now, the next part is what do you do when you assess the problem? You've got to assess, are they dependent? So somebody has occasionally taken benzos or binging on them, they're probably not dependent. So putting them on a script probably is not probably appropriate. We would do a urine test to show that there's benzodiazepines in their system and, it fits with the history. But I get a lot of people, they're very popular drugs, as we know, benzodiazepines, for a whole host of reasons. On presentation. So if we do a urine test on, and I'm not a big urine test fan, but at the start of treatment, we do a urine test, to see if they're opiates, and often there's methadone in their system. They've actually started buying street methadone before they start treatment. A lot of the time I notice benzos are in their system, and it's interesting exploring that. So they're popular drugs and they are misused, and we have some serious problems with benzodiazepines. In the sense that some of them are taking large amounts, some, stories of taking trays of them. Now, I don't want to spend all the time just talking about benzos in the sense without having the COVID kind of piece of this. So I'm going to move on to COVID because I'm mindful we're going to be struggling for a little bit for time. But I would say this, I do put people on benzodiazepines, usually no more, usually between 15 milligrams and 30 milligrams a day. Do I detox them? I'm going to be straight and honest here. I review their script every single month. And I talk about coming down. A lot of them are very reluctant to come down. Do they divert their tablets? Yes, they may well. I mean, when we start off, we have them on daily dispensing, but like a lot of people, we try and give them their life back. So how do you decide whether they stay on daily dispensing all the time? It's a tough one. It's difficult. You can't keep people on opiate substitution treatment all the time on daily dispensing, but they have to get their lives. So there has to be a little bit of trust there. And there's certain indicators, scripts ending before they should and stuff. They're little telltale signs that maybe you need to roll people in. Don't do a huge amount of testing in the whole week-to-week thing. I don't think it's that different in the UK in general. We've kind of put back on testing. In relation to COVID-19, and I think Digby mentioned it about requests for attending the chemist less frequently. We've had a real vogue over here for observed. I mean, I need to kind of say that observed dispensing as much as supervised dispensing. In other words, watching the dose go down. What I've done is, because of COVID-19, I've scrapped, a lot of the chemists are not letting people in. And I think there is a stigma issue to having someone on a street, literally they are on the street, having to drink a methadone dose. So I don't know if it's a big thing in the UK, and I think maybe it's variable, but certainly that's gone. So the observing of the dose, but they still do go in more frequently. Very, very chaotic cases, yes, possibly every day. But I'm trying where possible to loosen the restrictions in terms of COVID-19, just so that they're not having to go out and leave their house, because we are in lockdown over here in the end of the day. In relation to the guidance, just to say this, the guidance over here now has changed in relation to benzos. So what they're saying now, new presentations who may have a benzo problem are to be given benzodiazepine detox, but the benzodiazepine detox is to end when the COVID-19 restrictions loosen. Now that, to me, I say to people, COVID-19 has nothing to do with the whole benzodiazepine dependence. I mean, yeah, I can understand the point. I think Digby raised a bit, been locked in your house and you're usually used to going out and buying them. But for people who are actually benzodiazepine dependent, you're starting them on them, the idea that the restrictions loosen and then you take them off it when they may not be ready. I mean, we won't get into this discussion today. There's a whole other problem here with trying to keep people benzodiazepine free. There's huge social problems, poverty, homelessness, criminality. We've got so many problems that make it very, very difficult. Some of the patients I treat on a daily basis just struggle with life. They struggle with, having a routine to their life. A lot of them, unemployment is high. So when we try and get them off benzodiazepines, and I do get some off, and they stay off, and they're very, very motivated, but I have to say too few. Now this brings me on to just one other point, and that is, the research. A lot of the people that I talk to that don't like benzos say there's no good research that staying on benzos a long time works. But there's also, it depends on what outcomes you're looking at. Well, the idea that we're looking at outcomes of people having dementia and so on, I'm talking about people who don't seem to be able to manage to be not prescribed benzos. In other words, if you stop the benzos, what my sense of this is they go out and buy them again, or they go, I hate to use that phrase, doctor shopping, but they go to many other sources to try and get them. And really what I want to try and do is I want to at least try and keep a handle on this. And I think one of the things that's key in this is a really good therapeutic relationship with your patients, that they trust you and they can talk to you. And I always say to patients, just tell me the truth. I not to be too kind of a few good men about it. I can handle the truth. So although the truth might seem mucky, I want to hear it because I want to know what's going on. And I appreciate people will tell lies and people will buy, will sell their tablets and stuff. I haven't seen anybody, other than making people go in every single day to a pharmacy, I haven't seen any real good remedy to diversion. Not one country, nowhere, no jurisdiction has managed to cure the problem of diversion. I will make one point, and I'm going to finish on this. You could argue that if everyone was getting evidence-based treatment and everyone was looked after, would there be diversion? Like, why do people buy diverted methadone? It's not a drug of abuse by and large. Some people do, but a lot of the time it isn't. It's people who buy it as a medication. And the question is, treatment is very, very plentiful in Dublin, not so much around the country. Why would people go down and pay well over the odds for this? And there's a good reason for that. They don't want to be in treatment. In some cases, they can't get into treatment. And I think that's one thing that's been great with COVID-19. The restrictions have lifted and we're getting everybody into treatment, and we're trying to replicate this around the country. So listen, I could talk probably all day on this, and I want to give the other speakers a chance to get in. Thank you very, very much for giving me this opportunity, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions that anyone might have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Garrett. That's terrific to get the Irish experience and your personal view on that, which I'm sure a lot of people would concur with and maybe others wouldn't. Can I bring in our final speaker, who's Prun from CGL, based in England. So I guess he's largely going to give an English, but perhaps with a twist of the UK perspective. Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks very much to SDF for inviting me today. I should say right at the beginning, I mean, we've heard from frontline clinicians. I'm not a frontline clinician anymore, and I haven't been for some time. So my expertise on the front line is some years past. But just to give you a bit of my background, I grew up in Scotland, in Argyll, went to school in Glasgow, went to uni in St Andrews, and then that brought me to Manchester. So I'm now based in Manchester, and have been since the late mid-90s actually. I trained as I did all my medical training in the Northwest, and then entered specialist training to become a consultant psychiatrist. So I'm an addiction specialist. I'm currently the medical director of Change, Grow, Live. That's a health and social care charity, providing quite a bit of clinical services in England, and sort of psychosocial services, partnering with the NHS in Scotland. I wear a few other turbans, hats, whatever you'd like to say. In the COVID context, I'm also the addiction faculty rep to the COVID advisory group for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. and I'm on the technical committee of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. So I'm so glad to be here, but when I spoke to Dave, I actually wanted to just come and learn. I thought when it comes to benzodiazepines, this may not be what Scottish people want to hear, but I think Scotland has a lot of expertise in benzodiazepines, and I think it's been there's a long history of its use in Scotland, more so I think than in England. And I thought, I could perhaps learn something, and then Dave opportunistically suggested I say something about the English experience. I think what where my expertise really is learning how to make decisions and governance decisions that ultimately will benefit people that use our services, and making those the balance of risks about what to do to help as many people as we can. So from an English perspective, there's we've had a long history of benzodiazepine use as well in the country. We know about where benzos came from. They were a safer alternative to barbiturates until people realized that maybe there are some problems with them. And then there was quite a I suppose, a concerted effort to reduce prescribing of benzodiazepines in primary care and secondary care. And that was largely effective. What's interesting, though, I think, is that where people used to prescribe benzodiazepines, that seems to have now shifted to gabapentinoids, so things like pregabalin, gabapentin, and other drugs. And I think it is interesting that people will find a way to find the drug that they need and suits them, regardless of what diagnosis or label we might put on people. But in England, as far as substance misuse services have operated, largely we have supported primary care in helping advise how reductions around benzodiazepines might take place where people are prescribed them in primary care, or if people are using them in a sort of dependent fashion, being able to actually prescribe them ourselves. So our current policy is to prescribe diazepam generally up to 30 milligrams, but on a case-by-case basis and always on a reduction plan. My own clinical experience and experience from colleagues, I asked their views before I came on here, and there's kind of like an old rule of thumb that however many years somebody's been taking benzodiazepines for is going to take that many months to actually help them reduce, and that's not been too far from my experience as well. So when we think in terms of benzodiazepines in the context of the current pandemic, I would say that our focus hasn't been on benzodiazepines at all. It's been on the kind of pressing issues of medication, opioid medication-assisted treatment, and there's just no way that we've been operating business as usual. And in terms of practice, it's not been possible, frankly, to operate as we have always done. It's just impossible. The kind of services that we've relied upon, ancillary services like pharmacy, community pharmacies, just haven't been able to function, and there's been no capacity. And there was a very real risk that people actually who were compelled to actually go to pharmacies on a regular basis, put themselves at risk, may not even get their medication. So it certainly wasn't business as usual down here. But what we started to notice is that there were more and more reports of benzodiazepine use, more than we were used to, and it was on a regional basis. And when we explored this further, we heard that most of these benzos are coming from the internet generally, rather than them being prescribed and diverted. These are higher potency benzos. I think you're very familiar with them in Scotland. So things that are sold as diazepam or Xanax may not be either of those drugs at all. And it does seem to be increasing. So it became a bit of a rapidly, we got this intelligence and thought we needed to look at this and see, is our current policy actually appropriate and suitable for the current situation? And that led me to get in touch with colleagues like Garrett and other people, SDF, spoke to Dave and colleagues to think, what could we do and think about? But the first question I asked colleagues is, what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve? Because there are different clinical pictures of people using benzodiazepines, and Digby and Garrett have already described what some of those might be. But when we talk about actual dependence on things, you ask yourself, why do people use benzodiazepines? Well, why do people use any drug? And while it may present as anxiety or whatever. Actually, it's the underlying issues. In my experience, often it's unresolved trauma that people have had that they've just never had an opportunity to even discuss or get help for, or even if they've tried to get help, we're talking about incredibly complex issues. And so how that trauma can sometimes present is requiring relief from that trauma, and sometimes people use benzodiazepines for that purpose, similarly to alcohol and similarly to other drugs. So yeah, I perhaps don't have a lot to offer this debate as it currently stands, but what I am very keen to try and get to is to see is there a way that we can actually help people in their recovery. And what I mean by recovery in my mind, because it's individual for everybody else, is take any positive steps towards safety and health, making no judgments about what they need or why they need it, and using our clinical expertise to help them make decisions that will help them in the long run, help them and their families and the community. So I really feel like, and this current COVID experience, what it's taught me, something I've always believed, but we've had no choice, is that we need to believe in people, and we need to believe in the people that use our services. Garrett made a very good point about people using medication as medication, not because they necessarily want to enter services, because they can't. The barriers to entry into services are too high. Some of the protocols and policies around them are based on evidence which is old and actually quite linear and narrow, and doesn't necessarily reflect the complexity of society, the policy environment, the changing environment in which people actually live their lives. So what I would love to get out of this is to look at the guidance again and to see if, as a group of clinicians listening to the voice of people that use services and maybe have a lot more lived experience and living experience, is what can we do, what's within our gift to actually see how clinically we can help people who use benzodiazepines. I don't know how long that's been, Dave, but I think that's everything from me.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Prun. That's great. If we can have all the panelists, all the speakers back now, and if I can ask Austin Smith, our policy officer, also to come back in as well, because he's been checking all of the questions there. So do you want to kick off, Austin, with the first question or summary of questions around the topic?
Yeah, there's kind of wide-ranging questions. We'll hopefully get through them, or at least most of them. The first question, I suppose, is the most pertinent one, is the broad question about whether rapid access to OST and a benzodiazepine prescribing as a combined therapy is a means to address the drug-related death problem we face in Scotland. And as a supplementary to that, does COVID present an opportunity to develop that kind of level of service and do it at the necessary scale to impact on drug-related death figures?
Digby, do you want to come in as the resident Scot as opposed to the other two speakers?
Happy to. That's a difficult one, isn't it? Because it's hard not to speculate over what views folk might express, and I mean that in a genuine and kind way, because there will be plenty of folk who will say, well, look at what toxicologies are showing up in the drugs-related deaths. By and large, I'd still be, that's a reflection of it's prescribed. That's a reflection of folk coming forward and looking for treatment, and are responding to that treatment in a more sensitive way than we used to. As Garrett said, 20 years ago in Edinburgh, everyone would be on 60 and 60 and their build-up drinks. And that would be 60 mils of meth, which was usually not enough, 60 mgs of diazepam, which was usually far too much, and the build-up drinks as well. And things have changed. There's not a lot of difference maybe between Calvinistic Scots and Catholic Irish in terms of using the word punishment, as you did advisedly, Garrett, in your presentation. And I think we still know there are plenty of colleagues around who would still see that as it's almost a moral issue rather than a health-related one. I would have no good difficulty, and I wouldn't want anyone to misunderstand what I said before about diazepam detoxes. I don't have a huge issue with prescriptions for diazepam. It's the pretense that it's not going to be a maintenance thing for most folk. I think realistically, particularly my kind of patient, in terms of alleviating the trauma that you were speaking about, Prun. And I think, as I say, if we're talking about benzos, we're almost always talking about OST as well. So having them side by side completely makes sense for a lot of our patients. There's plenty of folk who are on OST without a benzo, of course, but there's plenty of folk with a benzo where there are other issues as well, medication dependence-wise. And I agree with Prun. We are, again, in this neck of the woods, it tends to be quetiapine as a major tranquilizer. We're maybe thinking about offering as a non-addictive major tranquilizer with fewer side effects, prescribed off license at low dose, to try and pretend we're addressing the consequences of the trauma while we're waiting for 1 year psychological therapies waiting lists to come to fruition. We shall see how it all pans out with politicians' votes post-COVID, whether they can back up their weekly clap with some proper staffing payments and recruitment levels and the like.
Okay, thanks a lot, Digby. Garrett, do you want to add to that? You have to unmute yourself.
Unmute. Yeah, I completely agree with Digby. I mean, there is a lot of stuff kind of masquerading as pretending we're doing something. I think side by side, I couldn't agree more. You know, the great thing about opiate substitution treatment services is, I hate to use the phrase, but you do have a captive audience. They generally do come. We do get people who default out of treatment, but it's a very, very small number. And we, you know, in our clinics, we have the time to see them. We're seeing people a little bit less now. I know in the UK, I don't know quite what it's like in Scotland. It's a little bit like Ireland. Maybe we don't have the phenomenon of key workers in Ireland, so doctors largely will see the patients. But the one great thing is that, you know, we can see people less frequently and open the doors to see people who need our services more frequently. And we've an open door anyway. We're there all the time, so they can come in pretty short notice and get things sorted out. But the one thing, and I'll go back to what I said earlier, is we can't kind of adopt a situation, and it's changing a bit in Ireland. It's been a slow change, where we prescribe opiate substitution treatment, but we kind of wanted to not deny the benzos is the issue. Now, there is a thing here, and Digby and Prun will understand what I'm talking about particularly, but probably possibly many other people, and that's the whole shadowy sector of the regulators, i.e. the Medical Council. So there is a lot. If you look on the General Medical Council website, and you look at fitness practice hearings around drug use, you'll see, you know, figuring prominently in there is benzo prescribing. Now, sadly, a lot of it is seat of the pants stuff. People who are not specialists, vast majority are GPs. And the thing that gets me there is you know, there is a tendency to think these are bad people. They're not bad people. They're struggling. Some of them are working in very, very difficult communities from the social point of view, really difficult communities, and they become isolated figures, and they begin to get punished and censored and so. And I don't think that's the way to go. If someone has a benzo, and I'm not just talking about people who are opioid dependent, I'm talking about anybody. We need better services for people who struggle with benzodiazepines, whether it's detox. I hate to use the, you know, we may as well say this. I mean, I have patients on benzos for years and years and years. I don't measure the outcome on whether they're on them for years and years and years. I look for other outcomes. How are they getting on? What's their mental health like? How are they presenting? Is the script running short? How are they doing from other drug point of view, alcohol, etc.? So I think we need to be a bit less narrow of what those outcomes are, rather than just pinpoint the fact that somebody's on benzos for longer than they should.
Thanks for that, Garrett. Prun, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, just I agree with what Garrett just said. Just to the question about the some of the opportunities. I mean, just as an example, in the month before COVID lockdown, we were able to provide same-day prescribing for 30% of the people that came to our services for MAT. Opioid MAT, that is. But there was a wide range of time delay that people had to wait before they could access it. In the month after, it was 60%. It's quite incredible. I mean, we did not anticipate this necessarily, that the barriers to treatment may be ones that are part of the structure and the systems that we're used to actually operating, even though we all want to try and break them down and make it easier to access. I think rapid access to evidence-based treatment is really essential, and that's important. There's something about what Garrett says around the regulation and some of the scrutiny, because you can help people and know you're helping a lot of people, but then harm can come, which may be linked to the treatment that you provide. And after the fact, it can be very easy to make that link when actually the hundreds and hundreds of people that you treat on a daily basis who are fine and managing, they're not present anywhere in those kind of statistics. I think there's something about the evidence base to give that comfort about, what does help people. I think there was some evidence, there was a study done, I think it was in Dublin or Ireland, around supervised consumption not that long ago, which was asking the question about how beneficial is it actually for the individual in terms of a variety of different sort of outcomes. And maybe we do need to start collaborating a bit closer around our experience post-COVID. Maybe we do need to be asking the questions around the evidence base and seeing what evidence is there and what evidence needs to be revisited. And in terms of the outcome, finally, is the outcome more about what benefits the individual rather than what is some outcome that we believe is important?
Thanks, Prun. Yeah, certainly the whole issue of legacy post-COVID-19 is something that is a sort of a major topic of discussion at the moment, and how much of those changes we can hang on to. Obviously, the positive changes that we've seen, and the lack of adverse reactions to some of those changes. Austin, do you want to come back in again?
Sorry, I always do that. I am unmuted. There's a few technical questions. If you don't mind, I'll kind of roll them into one, because I'm not sure if there's an overlap between them, or that different people would want to focus on one or the other. One of them is about community diazepam detox. What regime would be used, and is there any experience of using epilepsy or seizure prophylaxis only as an option for detox in the community?
Okay,
the other one
Austin, should we maybe take them one at a time? Because
okay, if we have time, yeah.
Who wants to take that one first? Okay, Prun.
The thing about it's a very interesting question around the use of anti-epileptics. There's not, before I worked for Change Will Live, I worked in the NHS in an inpatient treatment setting, and we used to use carbamazepine in a sort of tapering regime over sort of a number of days very effectively. And we had considered it, actually. We're looking at our benzo policy right now. We considered that as a potential option in the community, considering the problems that we've currently got. I think where we arrived at, though, was, and these are discussions that are live with colleagues right now, many of whom might be actually watching this, so they might shoot me down later when I get off this call. But I think where we arrived at was we might actually be able to help people prevent seizures, but what we may not be able to do is prevent the withdrawals from benzodiazepines that they may then start experiencing, and we'd be left in the same kind of place. So where we sort of got to was, if people are going to need a detox from benzodiazepines, we should probably look at giving them benzodiazepines. That's where we've got to so far.
Okay, that's helpful. Austin, do you want to go to the next one? You have to unmute yourself again. No, you've done it now, I think.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, this is a kind of specific question, but I'll generalize it. It's simply about people presenting who are using a combination of street benzos. They're maybe using Xanax and Nitizolam and Valium and different things in different days in high doses. Where do you even start with transferring them onto a prescription and then reducing? What's the mechanism for doing that?
Garrett, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Austin. Thanks, Dave. It's terribly difficult. In my own view, it's a little bit like alcohol withdrawal. Whenever I assess a patient for alcohol withdrawal, the one thing we are really always mindful of is when we give people Librium to come off alcohol, we want to make sure that we give them enough Librium so that they don't get really bad withdrawal symptoms, and particularly seizures, because seizures in like things like DTs and things like that, that can be fatal. in relation to benzos, you really have to do that assessment, and it does beg the question whether somebody with that type of history, Austin, that you're describing, I'm sure it can be done as an outpatient, but I really think in those cases where you're really a little bit worried, I think we need inpatient. This is not rehab, this is not 28 days and therapeutic communities. We just need detox facilities at the very least. Yeah, sure, offer all the other bells and whistles treatment, but we need a safe medical unit for those patients to be assessed in and safely detoxed if that's what we're going to do. I think doing it in the community can be done, but it can be risky. You know, it can be risky, and apart from that, it can just fail. And the other problem you have there is that you don't really know what the starting dose is going to be, because some of the histories that they're presented are a combination of benzodiazepines, different half-lives and stuff, but in massive amounts. And, you know, you're sort of in this kind of quandary where you're not going to prescribe those benzodiazepines. We tend to usually go to one simple benzodiazepine, that's diazepam, but not in huge amounts. So I think we do need to be cautious and have, you know, that's easy for me to say that, but those services are almost absent in Ireland. I don't know what the situation is in the UK.
Okay, thanks, Garrett. Austin.
Hi, yes, and the other one is maybe for Digby. It was about your ethical concerns around somebody who was testing negative because of the inadequacies of testing, perhaps, but is displaying the signs of dependence and withdrawal. What are the ethical issues there, and how do you address them?
Thanks for the question. I think maybe it's, again, perhaps it's kind of patients presenting to me. The step before looking at any kind of detox would be just a couple of toxicologies and a diary, because a lot of the time folk are they're buying what they think is something, but it actually turns out to be something else. So we need to get just a bit of a handle on exactly what's going on. I think even before the COVID virus we each got a letter from our regulatory authorities to say that when we get complained about our clinical practice, the GMC in my case will take into account the environment I was working within when they hear that and come to consider that particular case. It doesn't fill me with massive confidence, but it still means we know that we're arguably lowering our standards slightly across the board just to keep the ship afloat. So the pharmacies aren't closing their doors, and we're able to cope with the different style of ongoing workload that we've got. So I guess the first starting point would still be to try and get a bit of a handle with the patient's help on exactly what might be in their system and how it's getting in there. I guess thereafter, I'm personally, call me a GP, usually pretty comfortable to tolerate where the ethics might stop, or where it bumps up against the pragmatism of a practical outcome for the patient, and how I might go about addressing that. And the GMC have got about 12 months more to get me, otherwise I'm free and easy.
Okay, thanks Digby. Austin, another question?
Yeah, sorry, the questions are flooding in at the last minute. Yeah, and one of the sort of procedural things, I suppose, is under COVID, has testing become more difficult to take oral fluid samples and so on, and what services doing to replace that or to work around the omission of the availability of testing?
Prun, do you want to take that? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's been a massive issue, and actually what it's meant is that we've had to make judgments. I mean, obviously, you know, we need to look after the safety of people working in services, you know, our staff as well. That's really critical, and we've had to make judgments on things. So if we've not been able to test, that hasn't stopped us actually prescribing for people. So this is where we talk about believing in people, that, you know, when somebody's coming in and giving a history, an assessment of opioid dependence, and it's a solid assessment and the clinician's done that assessment, we've made prescribing decisions to actually swap them in their treatment with whatever oversight we can put around that. A test is not the be all and end all. It's actually remarkably easy to actually get around a test. It's just it's one measure of an additional governance that can help support your decision making. So we have done that. However, what we're also trying to look at is perhaps tests which are less invasive. With urine sampling at this point in time is just not feasible. So things like fingerprint analysis, where we can give somebody a card, it's not even clinical waste. We're exploring those kind of options. We do want to return back to, as close as possible, the guidelines that existed pre-COVID. It's a journey, and every day pretty much. So that's our intention.
Okay, Austin, Garrett wants to come in. Sorry. Yeah. Still can't hear you,
sorry,
Garrett.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
You got me? Just a point in relation to this. I don't do a huge amount of testing in the generality of my work, but obviously at the start of treatment and maybe when someone goes missing for a while, we'll do it and to do it. I have to say the tests it's come on a little bit in terms of urine testing, and I don't know, maybe I'm still at risk of capturing COVID. I don't know. I don't seem to have developed any symptoms, but I have done the odd test in the last few weeks, and the way in which we have these very interesting pots that basically the patient will do a pee and they'll go into the toilet and they'll take a pee, and what happens is I don't have to touch the pot at all. They basically the test is on the outside, so it's just a strip, and I don't have to go anywhere near it. And in fact, they can dump it, so I can still see the result without really going very much near the test. I don't know if that, maybe I'm getting you teaching how to suck eggs, and that's what you do. But I felt I haven't got to go near the test, and yet we get it done, and nobody else is getting any exposure to the person's urine sample. So it seems to work well. I said I'm not doing a huge amount of them, but sometimes a guy went missing for a couple of weeks in the clinic on opiate substitution treatment, and I just felt a bit happier having an opiate result in the test. There was opiates in it and methadone, which just in terms of tolerance and stuff like that, I just wanted to see what he was doing. And I have to say it works fairly well. So it's not, the COVID-19 hasn't been a barrier in relation to that, really. We've been able to get around it.
Thanks, Garrett. I was just going to suggest, Austin, that we gather up all the other questions and maybe deal with those, obviously, because we're coming to the end of this webinar. I maybe just want to ask the three panelists, where next with this agenda, and maybe start with Digby just as a way to close.
If we're talking about after Corona, I thought Prun's point about how easily it has become obvious that our professional practice can change, which actually improves services in some degree for a lot of our patients. Doubling the first day start of MET, OST, for instance. But I agree, it's all about the trust, and whether we've got lab tests or whatever to assist us with that. I think there's definitely going to be a post-Corona, post-2020 atmosphere that we're not going to be going back to where we were before. It'll see what kind of local attitudes and local service reconfigurations flow from that, and I think there will be a lot of variability. It'll be interesting to have plenty more discussions like this, but I think things won't be the same again.
Yeah, thanks, Digby. Garrett.
Yeah, I kind of answer this a different way. I'm worried that will there be any money left to be able to fund our services? That's my big worry, to be honest with you. But going back to the practices and stuff, we've changed practices, I think, for the better. It'll remain to be seen over time. I'm sure there's a piece of research in there to see, with the loosening of restrictions and more people given benzodiazepines, will this help in relation to drug-related deaths index? We're very much like Scotland. We're very high up in the league tables. We all know that, and this is a wider story, I don't have to tell you guys, the whole effect of prohibition on drug-related deaths. But definitely we know for definite, without a shadow of a doubt, that people who are outside treatment are far more likely to die than people who are inside treatment. So if there's one thing that's really been a positive in Ireland, is that people who need opiate substitution treatment are getting it. And the other thing to say is we're doing more and more of what we're doing today, video consultations. They do a lot of this in Canada, because it's such a wide expanse that, a doctor gets on a screen and many hundreds of miles away there's a patient who can get treatment. And I think we're doing more of that now. And we're getting people, like, let's be real about opiate substitution treatment. Let's call a spade. The medication does the talking. You know, I always say to doctors, the best thing you can do is go on automatic pilot to a large extent, because doctors seem to mess the whole thing up when they interfere with the medication. And so the medication is king, and prescribing that properly and correctly and according to the best available evidence is really important. And it's important to get everybody who needs it to have access to it.
Okay, thanks, Garrett. We're sort of out of time, but Prun, do you want to just have a quick final word, just because I left you out there?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I mean, I think the key thing is access and making it easy as possible with no barriers. Clinical practice, the least restrictive that we can make it, and start actually working from that principle, and not just assuming that people need to be on the restrictive end of treatment, but actually it's the opposite way around, and put the onus on the clinicians. I think contact being really meaningful. That's one thing that we've learned. Some of the people that use our services said they would never felt so well supported over the phone, and just really making a difference for people as best as possible.
That's great. No, that's great messages to end on. So I'm afraid, as I said, we're out of time. We have recorded this webinar, so we'll put it up on our YouTube channel for others to see it, and obviously that will help keep this discussion going further. We'll also send out an evaluation shortly, and it would be good if you could complete that for us. Just to say that our fourth free COVID-19 webinar will focus on mental health among people who use substances during the pandemic. And this will be held on Thursday next week, because Friday's a bank holiday. So 1 p.m. on Thursday next week is the date for that. So we'll be pleased if you'll join us then. Finally, I'd just like to thank the speakers and yourselves for attending. So thanks again. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.